Picture the chaotic, electrifying backstage of the 2018 Billboard Music Awards. Global pop sensation Camila Cabello finally meets the 7 reigning kings of K-pop, BTS. But instead of raving about their flawless visuals or designer outfits, she was left completely paralyzed by something invisible yet overwhelmingly powerful: their scent. She literally confessed she couldn't even move. We all know these boys dominate the global charts, but who knew they were secretly hoarding the most intoxicating fragrances in the entire music industry? Was it a ridiculously expensive luxury cologne, a surprisingly sweet body mist, or just that naturally magnetic superstar aura? Get ready to dive deep into the ultimate backstage mystery that instantly had the entire army drowning in massive jealousy. Out of all 7 members standing in that iconic group photo, who actually holds the undisputed crown as the ultimate best-smelling guy? Can you lock in your guess for the legendary #1 spot before we finally expose the truth?
Number 7. Suga, the subtle and clean enigma. Kicking off our legendary countdown at number 7 is none other than the quiet genius and stoic anchor of the group, Min Yoon-pi, globally beloved as Suga. When you take a moment to truly picture the absolute electrifying madness of the 2018 Billboard Music Awards backstage area, a chaotic sensory overload filled with blinding camera flashes, screaming crowds, nervous industry executives, A-list celebrities constantly bumping shoulders, and a heavy, almost suffocating mixture of overwhelming designer perfumes aggressively competing for attention in the air, you have to vividly imagine the pure, grounding, almost spiritual relief that comes from standing next to someone who simply smells like absolute, unbothered peace. While it is incredibly common in the Western music industry, and even among his own bandmates, to splash on high-end, heavily musky luxury fragrances to make a bold, unforgettable statement on the red carpet, Suga takes a completely different, almost silently rebellious route that perfectly and poetically aligns with his effortlessly chill, introverted personality, officially cementing his status as the undisputed, subtle, and clean master of the entire K-pop industry. Countless industry insiders, veteran makeup artists, close security personnel, and big hit staff members who have spent years working right beside him have frequently whispered behind the scenes that Suga genuinely doesn't rely on overpowering, room-filling colognes or aggressive chemical-heavy body sprays. Instead, his deeply personal signature scent is the incredibly comforting, intensely intimate aroma of premium mild soap, the crispness of freshly laundered clothes, and a very faint, natural human warmth that genuinely makes you feel like you have just wrapped yourself tightly in a freshly dried, fluffy white cotton blanket on a quiet, rainy Sunday afternoon. It is a highly specific, elusive scent that brilliantly speaks volumes without ever actually having to shout, which is arguably the most accurate ultimate reflection of who he is as a complex human being and an elite musical artist. Think deeply about the psychological contrast here for a second. This is the exact same man who famously spends countless grueling, sleepless nights locked away in total isolation inside his Genius Lab studio, pouring his darkest, most raw and painful emotions into heavy-hitting, aggressive rap tracks under his fierce alter ego, August D, producing multi-platinum, stadium-shaking hits and literally spitting fire on stage with an intense, intimidating swagger that can give a crowd of 80,000 people instant goosebumps. Yet paradoxically, when the booming stadium bass finally stops echoing and the blinding stage lights dim to black, the scent that actually lingers gently in his personal orbit isn't a loud, spicy, attention-seeking musk, but rather the gentle, pristine, almost innocent scent of a high-quality, soothing body wash, mixed perhaps with the faint, lingering aroma of a dark iced Americano and the crisp smell of a perfectly ironed minimalist cotton p-shirt. This breathtaking juxtaposition between the hardcore, Spitfire underground rapper and the soft, endlessly comforting aroma of immaculately clean skin is exactly what makes his scent profile so dangerously attractive, deeply addictive, and emotionally resonant for those incredibly lucky few who get close enough to experience it in real life. If you know anything about the science of the human brain, you know that the olfactory bulb is directly intrinsically tied to the brain's emotional and memory centers, meaning that a scent doesn't just register as a smell, it registers as a visceral feeling, and the feeling Suga projects is total safety, unwavering reliability, and an unshakable calm. During that fateful internet-breaking encounter with Camila Cabello, as the young pop star found herself suddenly and completely surrounded by the overwhelming, larger-than-life, intensely magnetic auras of all 7 BTS members closing in for the group photo, Suga's minimalist, fresh-out-of-the-shower fragrance almost certainly acted as a vital, calming anchor right in the middle of a dizzying sensory hurricane. There is a profound, undeniable psychological power in a man who feels absolutely zero need to mask his natural, authentic self with artificial chemicals, a man who is so deeply, unshakably confident in his own skin, his immense talent, and his hard-earned success that his flawless daily hygiene routine alone is more than enough to leave a lasting, paralyzing impression on global superstars. It is a masterclass in understated elegance, a scent that deliberately refuses to demand your immediate attention, but rather gently and warmly invites you into his fiercely guarded personal space, miraculously making you feel instantly grounded, relaxed, and deeply understood without him ever having to utter a single word. Dedicated fans who have had the extraordinarily rare, life-changing privilege of meeting him up close at intimate fan signs, high-touch events, or VIP meet and greets frequently share highly emotional, reflective, and wildly consistent accounts of how catching a whiff of Suga literally felt like finally coming home after a long, exhausting, emotionally draining journey, desperately struggling to find the words to describe a delicate, complex symphony of a faint hint of cool peppermint, pristine, clean linen, smooth acoustic studio wood, and the purest, most unadulterated essence of a man who takes immaculate care of himself behind closed doors. This is the absolute peak definition of the ultimate boyfriend material scent, completely devoid of any pretentious luxury branding, masterfully stripping away the untouchable, godlike superstar facade to reveal the grounded, fiercely loyal, deeply human boy from Daegu who just wants to make meaningful music, protect his loved ones, and live quietly and comfortably in a chaotic world. In an entertainment industry where celebrities are constantly engaged in an endless, exhausting arms race to outdo each other with the most expensive, exclusive, impossible-to-get perfumes, Suga's quiet, steadfast commitment to just being effortlessly, undeniably clean is a massive, confident flex that emphatically proves true magnetism doesn't ever come from a glass bottle, it comes directly from the soul. He proves that sometimes the absolute most intoxicating, mind-altering smell in the entire world is simply the total absence of chaos, replacing it with a quiet, steady heartbeat. But hold your breath, because if Suga's phenomenally comforting, soapy, minimalist embrace is only sitting quietly at the number 7 spot on our monumental countdown, can you even begin to fathom the intense, room-stopping, heart-racing fragrances that are actively waiting to ambush us as we climb higher up the list? What exactly happens to the atmosphere in the room when we transition from the quiet, clean, shadowy comfort of the Genius Lab to a sudden, vibrant, explosive burst of energetic sunshine that literally forces every single person in the vicinity to immediately turn their heads, drop what they are doing, and smile uncontrollably? Are you genuinely prepared to uncover which beloved member actively uses their signature scent as a literal high-voltage weapon of pure joy, boundless energy, and infectious charisma in our highly anticipated ranking?
Number 6. J-Hope, the explosive citrus sunshine. Stepping right into the wildly energetic and unbelievably vibrant number 6 spot on our ultimate scent countdown is none other than the undisputed dance commander, the tireless emotional battery, and the radiant living sunshine of BTS himself, Jungkook, universally adored by millions around the globe simply as J-Hope. When you stop to genuinely consider the sheer, terrifying physical exertion that goes into being the main dancer, choreographer, and performance leader of the biggest, most intensely scrutinized music group on the face of the planet, you might naturally, logically assume that heavy sweat, intense exhaustion, and the suffocating odor of a grueling gym session would be the dominant themes surrounding him. But J-Hope completely and miraculously shatters that mundane expectation by consistently defying all laws of physics, smelling like an absolute invigorating burst of pure, high-definition, sparkling life. If Suga's heavily guarded personal scent profile from our previous spot is a quiet, reflective, rainy Sunday indoors wrapped in a soft white blanket, J-Hope's signature fragrance is a blindingly bright, cloudless, intensely colorful summer morning where absolutely anything feels possible, and the sheer joy of existence literally forces you out of bed. Industry professionals, deeply exhausted backup dancers, veteran makeup artists, and the incredibly lucky stylists who have spent countless, agonizingly long hours trapped in stuffy, unventilated backstage dressing rooms, chaotic stadium tunnels, or grueling, merciless 12-hour dance practice sessions at the massive HYBE headquarters have frequently and enthusiastically gone on record to express their absolute, unadulterated amazement at how Hoseok seemingly never ever loses his immaculate, almost supernatural freshness. His heavily analyzed scent profile is famously deeply rooted in aggressively bright, zesty, and aggressively energetic citrus notes. We are talking about the incredibly sharp, mouth-watering, hyper-realistic aroma of freshly peeled, sun-ripened grapefruits, the crisp, waking slap of Italian lemon zest, the sweet, incredibly inviting, warm embrace of juicy mandarin oranges, and perhaps just a tiny, highly sophisticated grounding hint of fresh peppermint, crushed green tea leaves, or very light cedarwood to perfectly balance out the overwhelming sugary sweetness. This is not just a random perfume pulled blindly from a department store shelf. It is a highly strategic, intensely deliberate, and deeply intelligent choice of fragrance that perfectly mirrors his larger-than-life, relentlessly positive, yet fiercely professional persona, emphatically proving that J-Hope doesn't just wear luxury perfume to simply smell conventionally good. He literally uses his carefully curated scent as a powerful, scientifically proven mood-altering weapon to aggressively uplift, inspire, and physically re-energize every single person lucky enough to breathe the exact same oxygen as him. Scientifically speaking, bright citrus fragrances are heavily and successfully utilized in premium, high-end aromatherapy, specifically because they have been clinically proven to instantly reduce soaring cortisol levels, banish crippling, paralyzing anxiety, and trigger a massive, natural, immediate release of serotonin and dopamine in the complex human brain, which essentially means that standing physically next to J-Hope is quite literally, medically speaking, a verifiable life-altering serotonin boost that you cannot get from a pharmacy. Now, aggressively transport yourself straight back to the suffocatingly tense, incredibly high-stakes, hyper-competitive environment of the 2018 Billboard Music Awards, where a young, incredibly nervous, massively talented Camila Cabello was suddenly and completely thrust into the center of a massive, swirling, blinding hurricane of global media attention, desperately trying to hold her ground alongside 7 ridiculously handsome, intimidatingly successful, impossibly tall Korean superstars dressed in immaculate Gucci. In that overwhelming, heart-pounding moment of intense sensory overload, catching a vibrant, electrifying, completely unexpected wave of J-Hope's signature citrus fragrance must have felt exactly like stepping fully clothed into a beautifully refreshing, ice-cold, crystal-clear waterfall after frantically running a desperate marathon in the blazing, unforgiving heat of a desolate desert. It is a highly specific, aggressively friendly scent that forcefully commands your absolute attention, not by being dark, brooding, mysteriously seductive, or artificially heavy like so many standard Hollywood colognes, but by being so unapologetically joyful, overwhelmingly loud, and bursting with such vibrant, neon-colored energy that you genuinely, physically cannot help but smile like an absolute idiot the very second those citrus molecules hit your highly sensitive olfactory nerves. Dedicated fans and frantic media personnel who have experienced the absolute mind-blowing sheer luck of being crushed into the chaotic front row of a massive BTS stadium concert, or frantically surviving a dangerous, swarming international airport arrival, constantly and consistently marvel at how Hoseok's invisible, fragrant aura genuinely precedes his actual physical presence, carrying a bright,
bubbly, effervescent, almost carbonated energy that physically wakes up a sleepy, exhausted, crying crowd even before he actively steps out of the blacked-out VIP SUV and flashes that legendary, trademark, million-dollar heart-shaped smile that has literally saved lives. You have to genuinely imagine the sheer, heartbreaking dedication it takes to constantly and relentlessly be the designated hope of the group, to voluntarily and enthusiastically carry the massive, crushing emotional burden of keeping 6 other deeply exhausted, immensely pressured men motivated, smiling, perfectly synchronized, and completely ready to conquer the unforgiving Western music industry on absolutely minimal sleep. In this context, J-Hope's energetic, loudly citrus-forward fragrance is essentially his invisible, impenetrable superhero cape, a fragrant, vibrating armor of weaponized positivity that instantly and miraculously transforms a gloomy, stressful, panic-inducing room into a vibrant, high-energy, unstoppable celebration of life the very millisecond he confidently walks through the heavy door. There is a profound, incredibly specific, undeniable magic in a global pop star who actively refuses to rely on the heavy, intimidating, overly mature musk typical of ridiculously wealthy male celebrities, and instead confidently chooses to smell like the purest, most concentrated distillation of pure, unadulterated, infectious happiness, making his wildly energetic, fresh out of the dryer meets a sun-drenched tropical orchard scent one of the most uniquely recognizable, deeply cherished, and heavily debated aromas in the entire cutthroat K-pop industry. This deeply refreshing, zesty, life-affirming aromatic profile is absolutely fundamentally critical to unraveling the grand, viral mystery of Camila Cabello's stunned, breathless reaction, because while the other members standing proudly beside her might actively try to visually or aromatically seduce your overwhelmed senses with dark, expensive, aged woods, suffocatingly sweet florals, or aggressively clean soap, J-Hope completely, effortlessly bypasses all your natural emotional defenses and forcefully injects pure high-voltage golden sunshine straight into your freezing veins, leaving you totally stunned, heavily energized, heavily blushing, and desperately, hopelessly craving just one more hit of that immaculate sunshine-infused energy before he dances away. But as we painfully, reluctantly tear ourselves away from the blindingly bright, incredibly comforting, citrus-soaked, wildly energetic embrace of our beloved, heavily respected dance leader currently sitting at number 6, we have to desperately brace ourselves for a massive, dizzying, incredibly abrupt atmospheric shift as we plunge even deeper into the highly exclusive, heavily guarded territory of the top 5. If J-Hope is the blazing, energetic, loud, unapologetic sun that forcibly wakes you up, grabs you by the shoulders, and makes you want to dance until your feet literally bleed, who on earth could possibly be waiting silently in the shadows at number 5, with a fragrance so elegantly soft, mesmerizingly delicate, dangerously alluring, and heart-stoppingly beautiful that it practically hypnotizes, disarms, and completely ruins anyone who foolishly dares to get too close? Are you genuinely emotionally prepared to leave the bright, safe, comforting daylight of the citrus orchard completely behind and step blindly into a lush, intoxicating, desperately romantic moonlit garden where the most flawlessly graceful, deeply elegant, and dangerously captivating member uses a gentle, incredibly deceptive floral aura to completely captivate and paralyze his willing victims?
Number 5. Jimin, the mesmerizing floral illusion. Gliding effortlessly and with absolute breathtaking grace right into the highly coveted number 5 spot on our massive heart-stopping countdown is the undisputed ethereal siren of the BTS vocal line, the incredibly captivating, universally mesmerizing, and dangerously alluring Park Jimin. When you violently transition from the aggressive, high-voltage, blindingly bright citrus explosion of J-Hope, stepping directly into Jimin's heavily guarded, intensely intimate personal space feels exactly like walking out of a blazing, chaotic, deafening neon city street and instantly falling backwards into a plush, endless, deeply comforting bed of the softest, most delicate velvet-petaled midnight flowers that completely, helplessly, and willingly swallow you whole. If there is one single universally accepted truth consistently echoed by completely stunned industry professionals, heavily breathless backup dancers, exhausted makeup artists, and the extraordinarily lucky wide-eyed fans who have somehow managed to miraculously survive a close proximity physical encounter with this living, breathing piece of art, it is that Park Ji-min fundamentally and logically does not smell like a regular, sweating mortal human being. He smells like a walking, talking, highly expensive, absolutely untouchable fantasy, perfectly manifested into reality. His widely debated, deeply cherished, and fiercely analyzed signature scent profile is famously and broadly categorized as soft and floral. But do not ever for a single foolish, disastrous second make the massive, catastrophic mistake of confusing this with a cheap, synthetic, or overpowering traditional floral perfume that gives you a massive headache. We are talking about the absolute, highest possible echelon of bespoke luxury, a deeply intoxicating, almost maddeningly subtle symphony of delicate, blooming jasmine, the fragile, heartbreakingly beautiful whisper of powdery cherry blossoms, the creamy, comforting, deeply rich depth of pure white musk, and perhaps a dangerously seductive, lingering, heavy drop of warm vanilla that masterfully and seamlessly weaves together to create a fragrance so elegantly hypnotic it practically paralyzes your cognitive functions right on the spot. This deeply intentional, remarkably complex, and incredibly expensive smelling scent profile is the absolute, most flawless, mathematically perfect physical manifestation of his legendary, world-renowned, and heavily feared duality. The exact same mind-bending, terrifying duality that allows him to adorably, shyly smile with those iconic, squishy crescent moon eyes that effortlessly melt millions of hearts across the globe, affectionately earning him the soft nickname Mochi, only to violently, mercilessly, and abruptly snap into a fierce, stage-dominating, gravity-defying contemporary dance demon who can effortlessly command a screaming, weeping stadium of 90,000 people with a single, arrogant, perfectly timed flick of his silver hair. His signature floral fragrance completely and flawlessly embodies this exact, terrifyingly beautiful psychological paradox. It is deceptively soft, incredibly inviting, and warmly gentle at first sniff, actively luring you in with a false, comforting sense of total security. But the very absolute moment you actually lean in to get a closer smell, the underlying, fiercely confident, dangerously magnetic, and aggressively sensual allure completely traps your overwhelmed senses, aggressively refusing to ever let you back to breathing normal oxygen again. Scientifically and psychologically speaking, soft, premium, high-end floral scents are heavily and historically associated with deep emotional intelligence, profound world-healing empathy, and an unapologetic, completely unrestrained embrace of one's own fluidity and grace, which is exactly why Jimin, a fiercely confident man who repeatedly, effortlessly, and historically shatters toxic, outdated gender norms on a global scale by beautifully wearing delicate corsets, heavily embellished dangling jewelry, and dramatic, smoky, intimidating eye makeup, while simultaneously exuding a raw, undeniable, devastatingly powerful masculine dominance, can naturally pull off such an exquisitely delicate, traditionally feminine aroma with such terrifying, mind-altering, and absolute perfection. Now I need you to vividly, aggressively, and viscerally imagine the absolute, unprecedented emotional chaos and complete sensory meltdown actively unfolding inside Camila Cabello's head during that legendary, internet-breaking, frantically photographed backstage photo op at the massive 2018 Billboard Music Awards. As the heavy, suffocating, aggressively masculine, heavily spiced woodsy colognes of standard, predictable Hollywood A-list
monsters relentlessly assaulted her exhausted senses from every single direction in that chaotic, screaming, flashing backstage corridor. Suddenly, gently, almost exactly like a phantom breeze from a hidden paradise, she is unexpectedly hit by the breathtaking, impossibly elegant, soft, mind-numbing floral aura of Park Jimin, who was standing right there, practically glowing with his signature, intimidatingly flawless porcelain skin and that devastating, knowing, slightly wicked smirk. It must have genuinely felt like a sudden, disorienting, beautiful glitch in reality, a momentary, stunning suspension of time, where the chaotic, screaming, flashing world of the music industry completely faded away into total silence, leaving only the delicate, expensive, hypnotic, and utterly paralyzing scent of a global pop prince who practically glides across the marble floor rather than actually walking like a normal human being. It is a highly specific, deeply intimate scent that actively, fiercely demands a deeply close physical proximity to be truly, fully appreciated, unlike those heavy, arrogant, room-filling musks that aggressively shout for your attention from across a crowded room. Jimin's signature floral fragrance whispers, highly seductively and dangerously, right directly into your ear, forcing you to unconsciously, helplessly lean in closer, completely involuntarily dropping all of your natural evolutionary defenses before your brain even realizes what is actually happening to your body. Those incredibly rare, highly emotional, passionately tearful accounts of hardcore veteran armies who have had the massive, life-altering, incredibly lucky privilege of attending those heavily restricted, intensely intimate fan signs back in the earlier, chaotic days of their career, consistently, almost religiously, and fiercely describe his unique scent as being incredibly comforting, yet profoundly, deeply intoxicating, exactly like being tightly and securely wrapped in a luxurious, freshly laundered, heavily expensive silk robe that was carelessly, romantically left to dry in a massive, blooming, heavily guarded royal garden at the exact, quiet, breathtaking moment of twilight. It is a wildly romantic, deeply poetic, heavily atmospheric, and aggressively sensual aroma that completely reflects his breathtaking, grueling background as an elite, classically trained, top-tier contemporary dancer, where every single microscopic physical movement is deeply intentional, relentlessly fluid, and fiercely, aggressively beautiful, actively transforming the very air around his physical body into a thick, heavily romantic, invisible halo of pure, unadulterated, blinding aesthetic perfection that genuinely makes your heart physically ache and palpitate in the absolute most exhilarating way imaginable. In an aggressive, highly competitive, heavily toxic global music industry where incredibly wealthy male artists constantly, desperately, and aggressively try to out-macho each other with the most potent, aggressive, heavily spiced, violently loud woodsy colognes imaginable, Jimin's wildly romantic, deeply poetic, heavily atmospheric, and aggressively sensual aroma is a massive, quiet, completely devastating, and absolutely brilliant power move that firmly and undeniably establishes him not just as a massively successful global idol, but as an untouchable, living, breathing, historical piece of high-end art that fundamentally and stubbornly refuses to ever be categorized, easily boxed in, or quickly forgotten by the masses. But as we desperately, painfully, and reluctantly try to forcefully shake off the lingering, heavily hypnotic, beautifully mind-numbing floral spell that Jimin has so flawlessly and mercilessly cast upon our heavily compromised, exhausted senses, we must now forcefully and aggressively brace ourselves for an incredibly massive, aggressively grounded, and violently towering atmospheric shift as we rapidly crash headfirst into the highly anticipated, heavily debated number 4 spot on our legendary, heart-stopping countdown. If Jimin is the delicate, dangerously alluring, incredibly beautiful, hypnotic midnight flower that gently, deceptively, and beautifully pulls you into a gorgeous, inescapable velvet dreamscape, who on earth is the massive, deeply rooted, aggressively towering,
endlessly comforting ancient forest, waiting patiently and confidently at number 4, armed with a deeply philosophical, aggressively masculine, incredibly mature woody aroma that literally and instantly commands the absolute utmost respect, passionately screams absolute unwavering leadership, and makes you instantly, desperately want to confess all of your deepest, darkest, most heavily guarded secrets, while safely, securely hidden under the massive, impenetrable protective shade of his incredibly broad, world-carrying shoulders.
Number 4, the towering, earthy intellectual. Stepping powerfully and with immense, unshakable gravity right into the deeply respected number 4 spot on our massive, heart-stopping countdown is none other than the absolute, undisputed anchor, the brilliant mastermind and the fiercely protective leader of BTS himself, Kim Namjoon, globally revered and endlessly respected as RM. When you finally manage to forcibly and reluctantly rip yourself away from the intoxicating, hypnotic, delicate floral velvet dreamscape of Jimin that we just barely survived in the previous ranking, colliding directly into the massive, intensely grounding, overwhelmingly mature aura of Namjoon feels exactly like walking out of a dizzying, neon-lit, chaotic hallucination and immediately stepping barefoot into a profoundly silent, wildly majestic, ancient redwood forest that has stood strong, unbothered, and entirely self-sufficient for over 1,000 years. If there is one singular, universal, heavily documented truth consistently echoed by completely awestruck industry professionals, highly intimidated Western interviewers, exhausted translators, and the extraordinarily lucky fans who have miraculously found themselves breathing the exact same oxygen as this towering intellectual giant, it is that Kim Namjoon fundamentally and logically does not smell like a manufactured, plastic pop star desperately seeking fleeting validation. He smells like a ridiculously wealthy, deeply cultured art curator, a seasoned philosopher, and a man who is so incredibly, dangerously comfortable in his own skin that his mere physical presence instantly commands the absolute utmost respect from every single person in the room without him ever having to raise his signature, impossibly deep, honey-laced voice. His heavily debated, deeply cherished, and fiercely analyzed signature scent profile is universally categorized as woody and earthy, but you absolutely must understand that we are not talking about a generic, cheap, heavily synthetic lumberjack cologne that you can blindly pick up at a local drugstore. We are talking about the absolute highest echelon of sophisticated, bespoke, hyper-intellectual fragrance crafting, a deeply intoxicating, overwhelmingly mature symphony of rich, aged mahogany, the incredibly expensive, creamy warmth of authentic Indian sandalwood, the sharp, grounding bite of fresh cedarwood, the deeply comforting, dusty vanilla scent of ancient, leather-bound books housed in a grand library, and the incredibly specific, soul-soothing aroma of petrichor, that magical, earthy smell of damp soil and crushed leaves immediately after a heavy, cleansing summer thunderstorm. This deeply intentional, remarkably complex, and incredibly distinguished scent profile is the absolute most flawless, mathematically perfect physical manifestation of his legendary world-renowned hobby famously known across the globe as namjooning, the quiet, fiercely guarded, highly introverted practice of riding his bicycle alone along the breezy banks of the Han River, silently observing forgotten, centuries-old paintings in empty rural art galleries, deeply watering his beloved, carefully pruned bonsai trees, and reading heavy, complex philosophical literature while the rest of the chaotic, exhausting entertainment industry burns itself to the ground chasing meaningless clout. You have to genuinely, deeply, and intensely think about the unfathomable, bone-crushing psychological burden and massive, suffocating pressure of being the sole designated leader and primary English speaker for the biggest, most intensely scrutinized musical act in the entire history of the world. Namjoon is the unbreakable trunk of the massive BTS tree, constantly shielding his 6 brothers from malicious Western media, translating highly complex cultural nuances on the fly, fly, delivering profoundly moving history-making speeches at the United Nations and bearing the collective weight of millions of expectations on his notoriously broad, towering 181-centimeter frame. In this heavily pressurized context, his intensely mature, deeply grounding, earthy, and woody fragrance serves as an invisible, impenetrable, heavily armored shield of absolute stability, actively calming his own overloaded nervous system while simultaneously projecting an overwhelming, undeniable aura, ultimate authority, unwavering reliability, and intense, intimidating intellect to everyone who dares to approach him. Now aggressively and vividly transport yourself straight back to the suffocatingly tense, incredibly chaotic, hyper-competitive environment of the 2018 Billboard Music Awards backstage area, where Camila Cabello was suddenly completely surrounded by this overwhelming, life-larger-than-life wall of flawless Korean superstars, amidst the sickeningly sweet artificial hairsprays and the loud, obnoxious, chemical-heavy colognes of standard Hollywood A-listers frantically running around the venue, catching a sudden, deep, intensely comforting wave of RM's ancient forest, vintage book, sandalwood-infused aura must have felt exactly like finding a massive, indestructible, quiet sanctuary right in the very middle of a terrifying, deafening hurricane. It is a highly specific, aggressively commanding scent that physically forces your racing heart to immediately slow down, aggressively triggering the deepest, most primal parts of the human brain that inherently associate the scent of rich, aged wood and damp earth with ultimate safety, intense protection, and profound, unshakable wisdom, making you instantly, desperately want to confess all of your deepest, darkest, most heavily guarded secrets while safely hidden under the massive, impenetrable protective shade of his incredible presence. Dedicated veteran armies and highly experienced music executives who have had the massive, life-altering privilege of shaking his hand or standing near him during high-stakes industry events frequently, consistently, and passionately describe his invisible, fragrant aura as the ultimate mature CEO or young professor aesthetic, an incredibly sexy, dangerously alluring scent that completely bypasses superficial physical attraction and violently seduces your actual intellect, leaving you completely stunned, heavily blushing, and completely lost in the deep philosophical depths of his legendary dragon eyes and devastating dimples. In an aggressive, highly toxic global music industry where incredibly wealthy male artists constantly and desperately try to outdo each other with the loudest, flashiest, most violently aggressive scents imaginable, RM's unwavering, fiercely confident, and intensely loyal dedication to his deeply grounded, unapologetically earthy, nature-inspired signature scent is a massive, quiet, completely devastating, and absolutely brilliant power flex that firmly and undeniably establishes him as an untouchable, living, breathing pillar of absolute strength, deeply rooted in the ground while effortlessly reaching for the stars. But as we desperately, painfully, and highly reluctantly attempt to forcibly step out of the grand, comforting, intensely intellectual ancient forest of Namjoon that has so flawlessly and mercifully protected our overloaded senses, we must now forcibly and aggressively brace ourselves for an incredibly massive, blindingly bright, and wildly refreshing atmospheric shift as we finally, officially breach the heavily guarded, highly exclusive, utterly terrifying territory of the top 3. If RM is the massive, deeply rooted, aggressively towering, endlessly comforting ancient forest that offers you ultimate, unshakable safety, who on earth could possibly be waiting confidently at number 3 with a fragrance so impossibly fresh, so classically flawless, and so blindingly clean that it literally feels like stepping directly into an exclusive, 5-star luxury spa suite reserved only for royalty? Are you genuinely, emotionally, and physically prepared to leave the earthy philosophical shadows completely behind and step blindly into the blinding, immaculate, world-dominating light of a man who uses a legendary, classic, high-end, soapy freshness to completely and utterly paralyze his willing victims and rightfully claim his title as the undisputed standard of worldwide beauty?
Number 3, Jin, the worldwide handsome classic freshness. breaking gracefully and with absolute, blindingly radiant confidence right into the highly coveted and fiercely competitive top 3 of our massive, heart-stopping countdown, is none other than the undisputed, self-proclaimed, and universally acknowledged visual king of the entire global K-pop industry. The man with the absolute golden ratio face himself, Kim Seok-jin, globally worshipped, adored, and endlessly praised as the one and only worldwide handsome. When you finally, desperately, and reluctantly manage to step completely out of the deep, heavily intellectual, towering ancient forest of RM's earthy, philosophical aura that we just barely survived in the previous ranking, colliding directly into the massive, intensely grounding, overwhelmingly pristine aura of Jin feels exactly like violently waking up from a complex, heavy dream and instantly, forcefully stepping directly into a blinding, immaculate, almost heaven-like wall of absolute, unadulterated purity that essentially feels like stepping into the world's most exclusive, hyper-expensive, heavily guarded, 5-star luxury spa suite securely located on the top floor of a massive, gleaming Seoul skyscraper. If there is one singular, absolute, heavily documented, and universally accepted truth consistently and passionately echoed by completely awestruck industry professionals, heavily intimidated veteran actors, exhausted backstage makeup artists, frantic stylists, and the extraordinarily lucky hyperventilating fans who have miraculously found themselves surviving the sheer, terrifying physical proximity of breathing the exact same oxygen as this towering, impossibly broad-shouldered visual masterpiece, it is that Kim Seok-jin fundamentally, aggressively, and beautifully refuses to smell like anything less than absolute, classic, undeniable perfection. His highly debated, deeply cherished, and fiercely analyzed signature scent profile is universally and proudly categorized as fresh and classic, but you absolutely fundamentally must understand that we are not talking about a generic, cheap, basic body wash, a harsh, synthetic sports spray, or a forgettable, standard, everyday laundry detergent. We are talking about the absolute highest possible echelon of sophisticated, bespoke, high-end French perfumery, specifically and heavily rumored by eagle-eyed fans and insiders to be deeply rooted in the iconic, deeply luxurious, and insanely expensive collections of the legendary fragrance house Diptyque, a prestigious brand historically renowned across the globe for flawlessly capturing the absolute purest essence of nature, botanical elegance, and pristine, untouchable cleanliness. This deeply intentional, remarkably classic, and incredibly expensive-smelling scent profile is the absolute, most flawless, mathematically perfect physical manifestation of his legendary, world-renowned visual aesthetic. An aesthetic so terrifyingly perfect, so fundamentally flawless, and so universally breathtaking that he literally went instantly viral on a global scale as the legendary car door guy and the heavily searched third guy from the left, simply by elegantly exiting a vehicle and breathing in front of massive, flashing, highly critical Western cameras. You have to genuinely, deeply, and intensely think about the unfathomable, bone-crushing psychological burden and massive, suffocating physical pressure of being the absolute, designated, official visual of the biggest, most intensely scrutinized, and heavily criticized musical act in the entire history of the world. Jin constantly, relentlessly, and effortlessly carries the massive, crushing expectation of always, without fail, looking exactly like a flawless, untouchable, ethereal prince who just walked straight out of a high-budget, tragically romantic historical drama. And in this heavily pressurized, chaotic context, his intensely fresh, deeply clean, aggressively classic fragrance serves as an invisible, impenetrable, heavily armored shield of absolute, pristine elegance that actively protects his energy. It is an incredibly specific, wildly refreshing, and deeply intoxicating aroma that perfectly, flawlessly mimics the exact heavenly, deeply comforting sensation of stepping directly out of a freezing, rejuvenating, crystal-clear rain shower, meticulously wrapping your physically exhausted, aching body in the world's softest, most ridiculously expensive, perfectly ironed, thick, white cotton hotel towel, and taking a massive, deep, cleansing breath of crisp, cool, completely unpolluted morning mountain air before the rest of the noisy world even wakes up. Now, I need you to aggressively, vividly, and viscerally transport yourself straight back to the suffocatingly tense, incredibly chaotic, screaming, hyper-competitive environment of the legendary 2018 Billboard Music Awards backstage area, where a deeply overwhelmed, wide-eyed, and incredibly nervous Camila Cabello was suddenly, unexpectedly, and completely thrust directly into the center of a massive, swirling, blinding hurricane of global media attention, completely surrounded by these 7 intimidatingly successful, impossibly gorgeous Korean superstars dressed in immaculate designer suits. In that overwhelming, heart-pounding, terrifyingly loud moment of intense sensory overload, amidst the sickeningly sweet artificial hairsprays, the heavy smell of burnt styling tools, and the loud, obnoxious, chemical-heavy, overly musky colognes of standard, predictable Hollywood A-listers frantically running around the cramped, unventilated venue, catching a sudden, crisp, intensely comforting, and blindingly clean wave of Jin's diptyque-infused, fresh out of the shower aura must have felt exactly like being violently, mercifully splashed right in the face with freezing holy water from a hidden, mythical fountain of youth in the middle of a burning desert. It is an incredibly specific, aggressively commanding, yet deceptively gentle scent that physically and forcefully demands your racing, panicking heart to immediately slow its rhythm, aggressively triggering the absolute deepest, most primal, deeply ingrained parts of the human brain that inherently and biologically associate the scent of pure, unadulterated cleanliness and classic, expensive soap with ultimate health, intense, radiant vitality, and profound, unshakable trust, making you instantly, desperately just want to stand there, completely frozen in time, dropping all of your professional boundaries just to endlessly, greedily breathe him in. Dedicated veteran armies, highly experienced, cynical music executives, and frantic media personnel who have had the massive, life-altering, utterly terrifying privilege of standing near him during high-stakes industry events, fan signs, or crowded airport mobbings, frequently, consistently, and passionately describe his invisible, fragrant aura as the ultimate, definitive, and heavily romanticized rich young CEO or perfect, unreachable son-in-law, aesthetic, an incredibly sexy, dangerously alluring scent that completely effortlessly bypasses superficial, cheap physical attraction and violently, deeply seduces your actual heavy soul, leaving you completely stunned, heavily blushing, rendered completely speechless, and completely hopelessly lost in the deep, flawless depths of his impossibly symmetrical, practically glowing, poreless face. In an aggressive, highly toxic, constantly shifting, and massively ego-driven global music industry where incredibly wealthy, insecure male artists constantly, desperately, and aggressively try to outdo, outstyle, and outsmell each other with the loudest, flashiest, most violently aggressive, incredibly pungent, and overly complicated luxury scents imaginable, Jin's unwavering, fiercely confident, deeply secure, and intensely loyal dedication to his deeply grounded, unapologetically classic, fundamentally and eternally fresh scent profile is a massive, quiet, completely devastating, and absolutely brilliant psychological power flex that firmly, aggressively, and undeniably establishes him not just as a massively successful, record-breaking global idol, but as an untouchable, living, breathing, historical pillar of absolute traditional and eternal beauty who fundamentally and stubbornly refuses to ever lower his absolute standards to chase cheap, fleeting, temporary trends. He actively, aggressively proves with every single confident, broad-shouldered, incredibly graceful step he takes across a massive stadium stage or a blinding red carpet that sometimes the absolute most intoxicating, deeply mind-altering, and ferociously attractive smell in the entire chaotic world is simply the total, unapologetic, and brutally confident embrace of classic, perfectly executed, high-end simplicity, masterfully replacing the chaotic, suffocating noise of the modern world with a quiet, steady, impossibly clean, and radiant perfection that literally stops time and leaves massive global pop stars completely paralyzed in their tracks.
But as we desperately, painfully, and highly reluctantly attempt to forcefully rip our heavily compromised, addicted senses away from the grand, comforting, intensely immaculate, freshly showered, pristine white towel paradise of worldwide handsome that has so flawlessly and mercifully purified our overloaded nervous systems, we must now forcefully, aggressively, and urgently brace ourselves for an incredibly massive, blindingly luxurious, wildly intimidating, and dangerously heavy atmospheric shift as we finally, officially, and terrifyingly breach the heavily guarded, highly exclusive, utterly devastating territory of the runner-up spot on our legendary countdown. If Jin is the blinding, immaculate, world-dominating, intensely comforting light of perfect, classic cleanliness that offers you ultimate, unshakable purity and peace, who on earth could possibly be waiting confidently, silently, and dangerously at the monumental number 2?
Number 2. Taehyung, the intoxicating high-end boldness. Stepping with devastating slow-motion grace and an absolutely suffocating gravity-defying aura of pure, unadulterated luxury right into the fiercely contested, highly dangerous runner-up position on our monumental countdown is none other than the undisputed, deeply mysterious, and universally feared global fashion icon of BTS himself, Kim Taehyung, universally worshipped across the entire globe simply as V. When you finally, desperately and reluctantly manage to violently tear yourself away from the blinding, immaculate, freshly showered, pristine white towel paradise of Jin that we just barely survived in the previous ranking, colliding directly into the massive, intensely intimidating, overwhelmingly expensive aura of Taehyung feels exactly like being abruptly dragged out of a brightly lit, safe, sterile room and forcefully, willingly plunged straight into the pitch-black, intoxicating, dangerously heavy atmosphere of an ultra-exclusive, heavily guarded, billionaires-only underground jazz club operating in the most expensive district of Paris at exactly 3 in the morning. If there is one singular, absolute, heavily documented, and universally accepted truth consistently and passionately echoed by completely terrified industry professionals, heavily intimidated Western celebrities, exhausted fashion magazine editors, frantic elite stylists, and the extraordinarily lucky, hyperventilating fans who have miraculously survived the sheer, mind-altering physical proximity of breathing the exact same oxygen as this towering, deeply soulful visual masterpiece, it is that Kim Taehyung fundamentally, aggressively, and beautifully refuses to smell like a normal, approachable human being. Instead, he smells exactly like an untouchable, ridiculously wealthy, highly dangerous cinematic villain who could effortlessly ruin your entire life with a single, slow, heavily hooded blink of his famously asymmetrical, intensely piercing eyes. His highly debated, deeply cherished, and fiercely analyzed signature scent profile is universally and proudly categorized as high-end and bold, and you absolutely fundamentally must understand that we are fiercely leaving behind the safe, polite, everyday fragrances of the mortal world to aggressively enter the hyper-exclusive, insanely expensive, unapologetically arrogant realm of top-tier luxury designer perfumery, specifically and heavily rumored by eagle-eyed insiders, veteran makeup artists, and obsessive fashion critics to be deeply, inextricably rooted in the iconic, aggressively masculine, and insanely potent collections of the legendary fragrance house Tom Ford, a brand historically renowned across the globe for flawlessly capturing the absolute, darkest essence of dangerous seduction, raw, unfiltered wealth, and a heavy, animalistic magnetism that physically demands absolute submission from everyone in the room. This deeply intentional, remarkably heavy, and incredibly expensive smelling scent profile is the absolute most flawless, mathematically perfect physical manifestation of his legendary, world-renowned aesthetic, an aesthetic heavily dominated by custom-tailored, oversized designer suits, massive glittering vintage jewelry, deeply unbuttoned silk shirts, expensive film cameras, and a deep, lifelong, soulful obsession with classical jazz music, beautifully proving that his soul genuinely belongs to a much older, more elegant, and dangerously romantic era. You have to genuinely, deeply, and intensely think about the unfathomable, bone-crushing psychological power and massive, intoxicating physical presence required to naturally, effortlessly pull off such an aggressively dominant, room-filling fragrance. We are talking about a deeply complex, heavy, mind-numbing symphony of dark, aged leather, the sharp, biting spice of premium crushed tobacco leaves, the creamy, intoxicating, deeply rich depth of authentic Madagascar vanilla, the heavy, smoky warmth of burning incense, and the incredibly expensive, deeply resinous aroma of rare oud wood that masterfully and seamlessly weaves together to create a fragrance so elegantly arrogant it practically paralyzes your cognitive functions right on the very spot and forcefully drops you to your knees. In the highly chaotic, suffocatingly tense, hyper-competitive environment of the legendary 2018 Billboard Music Awards backstage area, where a deeply overwhelmed, wide-eyed, and incredibly nervous Camila Cabello found herself suddenly, unexpectedly, and completely surrounded by this massive swirling hurricane of global superstar energy, the absolute sheer, terrifying gravity of Taehyung's presence must have been an earth-shattering sensory assault that completely rewired her brain. Amidst the loud, obnoxious, chemical-heavy, forgettable colognes of standard, predictable Hollywood musicians running around the cramped venue, catching a sudden, heavy, intensely suffocating, and dangerously seductive wave of V's Tom Ford-infused vintage leather and tobacco aura must have felt exactly like being completely paralyzed by a beautifully tailored, impeccably dressed phantom who just stepped out of a classic noir film, instantly freezing her completely in place because her exhausted nervous system simply could not process the overwhelming, intoxicating combination of that ridiculously expensive scent mixed with his legendary, devastatingly deep baritone voice that genuinely sounds like rich honey being poured over dark mahogany wood. It's a highly specific, aggressively commanding, yet dangerously deceptive scent that physically and forcefully demands your racing, panicking heart to immediately surrender, aggressively triggering the absolute deepest, most primal, highly vulnerable parts of the human brain that inherently and biologically associate the heavy, musky scent of fine leather and dark spices with ultimate, untouchable power, intense, terrifying mystery, and profound, undeniable masculine dominance, making you instantly, desperately want to just stand there, completely frozen in time, aggressively questioning every single life choice that led you to this breathtakingly dangerous moment. Dedicated veteran armies, highly experienced, cynical fashion executives, and frantic red carpet photographers who have had the massive, life-altering, utterly terrifying privilege of standing near him during high-stakes industry events, elite fashion weeks, or crowded VIP parties, frequently, consistently, and passionately describe his invisible, fragrant aura as the absolute, definitive, and heavily romanticized mafia boss or vampire prince aesthetic, an incredibly heavy, dangerously alluring scent that completely, effortlessly bypasses superficial, cheap physical attraction and violently, deeply seduces your actual trembling soul, leaving you completely stunned, heavily blushing, rendered completely speechless, and completely and hopelessly lost in the deep, flawless depths of his intensely expressive, dangerously sharp gaze. In an aggressive, highly toxic, constantly shifting, and massively ego-driven global music industry where incredibly wealthy, insecure male artists constantly, desperately, and aggressively try to chase fleeting temporary streetwear trends or safely hide behind boring, universally pleasing, unoffensive fresh scents, Taehyung's unwavering, fiercely confident, deeply secure, and intensely loyal dedication to his deeply grounded, unapologetically bold, fundamentally heavy signature scent is a massive, quiet, completely devastating, and absolutely brilliant psychological power flex that firmly, aggressively, and undeniably establishes him not just as a massively successful, record-breaking global vocalist, but as an untouchable, living, breathing, historical fashion icon who actively uses his fragrance as a heavy, velvet armor, masterfully replacing the chaotic, suffocating noise of the modern modern pop world with a quiet, steady, impossibly rich, and terrifyingly expensive darkness that literally stops time, drops jaws, and leaves massive global pop stars completely paralyzed, heavily breathing, and utterly speechless in their designer heels. But as we desperately, painfully, and highly reluctantly attempt to forcefully rip our heavily compromised, completely addicted, and trembling senses away from the grand, dangerously seductive, heavy leather and vanilla paradise of our beloved winter bear that has so flawlessly and mercilessly ruined our expectations for all other men on Earth, we must now forcefully, aggressively, and urgently brace ourselves for the ultimate, impossible, reality-shattering finale as we finally, officially, and terrifyingly breach the heavily guarded, highly exclusive, utterly legendary territory of the undisputed #1 spot on our massive countdown. If Taehyung is the dark, heavy, intoxicating, dangerously expensive velvet dream that completely paralyzes you with pure, unadulterated luxury and fear, who on earth could possibly, logically, and scientifically defeat him to claim the absolute crown, armed with a fragrance so incredibly unexpected, so wildly sweet, so aggressively addictive, and so powerfully universally beloved that it literally permanently rewired Camila Cabello's entire brain and sparked a massive global fandom meltdown that is still fiercely debated to this day? Are you genuinely, emotionally, and physically prepared to leave the heavy, intimidating billionaire darkness completely behind, abandoning all sense of logic to step blindly and willingly into a massive, blindingly vibrant, heavily intoxicating explosion of pure, sugary, fruity perfection where our absolute youngest, most fiercely competitive, brilliantly talented, and deeply legendary member actively uses a notoriously sweet,
Number 1. Jungkook, the addictively sweet golden champion, crowned. Smashing through the heavy, intimidating billionaire-level designer darkness of Taehyung with the absolute unstoppable force of a blindingly vibrant sugar-coated meteor, we have finally, officially, and breathtakingly arrived at the undisputed, universally agreed upon, and heavily anticipated absolute #1 spot on our legendary countdown, officially crowning the youngest, most fiercely competitive, brilliantly talented, and deeply loved golden maknae of BTS himself, Jungkook. When you forcefully and reluctantly tear your heavily compromised senses away from the dangerous, expensive leather and vanilla velvet trap of V, you might logically, completely reasonably expect the grand finale, the ultimate best-smelling champion of the world's biggest boy band, to wield an aggressively intimidating, incredibly complex, heavy musk that commands immediate, terrifying submission, but Jungkook completely, effortlessly, and brilliantly shatters absolutely every single predictable expectation by proudly, unashamedly, and fiercely wielding a scent profile so incredibly innocent, so violently sweet, and so aggressively, unapologetically fruity that it literally rewires your brain and leaves you completely helplessly addicted on the very first sniff. If there is one singular, absolute, heavily documented, and universally celebrated historical fact that hardcore veteran armies, exhausted industry professionals, and his own fiercely protective bandmates know deeply in their bones, it is that Jungkook possesses a genuinely supernatural, highly sensitive, practically superhuman olfactory system. He is notoriously, fiercely, and obsessively sensitive to smells, famously despising any harsh, unpleasant, or overly chemical odors, while actively, aggressively hoarding a massive, legendary, practically museum-worthy personal collection of sweet, fruity body mists, intensely comforting fabric softeners, and sugary, dessert-like perfumes that fundamentally make him smell exactly like a walking, breathing, heavily tattooed, muscular piece of literal candy. You absolutely fundamentally must understand the terrifying, mind-bending, gravity-defying psychological duality constantly at play here. A duality so potent and so visually conflicting that it genuinely drives millions of fans into absolute foaming at the mouth hysteria on a daily basis.
analysis. You are looking at a fiercely athletic, intensely competitive, toweringly strong alpha male who confidently struts across massive global stadium stages, covered in heavy, aggressive dark ink sleeve tattoos, sporting intimidating lip and eyebrow piercings, endlessly hitting the boxing gym until his knuckles bleed, and effortlessly performing grueling, gravity-defying choreography while projecting an overwhelmingly dominant, dangerously sexy aura. Yet when you actually manage to get close enough to breathe his exact same air, instead of smelling like harsh tobacco, dark wood, or arrogant designer musk, he miraculously, beautifully smells like a fresh, juicy peach, a handful of incredibly sweet, ripe summer berries, a warm, comforting splash of creamy vanilla, and a soft, sugary, intensely inviting fruit-scented body spray that you would typically find safely tucked away in a vibrant, colorful, brightly lit boutique. This is not just a random, accidental aesthetic choice. It is a heavily documented, historically proven, world-altering phenomenon, perfectly exemplified by the legendary, internet-breaking, global economic crisis he accidentally caused simply by casually mentioning on a quiet fan cafe chat that he deeply loved using an incredibly specific, sweet-smelling, floral and fruity downy fabric softener for his massive piles of laundry, instantly, aggressively causing the product to completely sell out across the entire nation of South Korea in a matter of mere hours, actively crashing massive retail websites, heavily depleting 2 months' worth of corporate stock in a single afternoon, and leaving the massive parent company completely paralyzed, completely stunned, and frantically scrambling to mass-produce enough sweet-smelling detergent to satisfy a suddenly desperate, rabid global fan base that fiercely wanted their own beds and clothes to smell exactly like his intensely comforting, sugary, fresh-out-of-the-laundry aura. Now, I deeply and aggressively need you to forcefully transport your fully engaged, deeply invested imagination directly back to that historic, intensely chaotic, hyper-competitive, fiercely loud backstage corridor at the 2018 Billboard Music Awards, the exact fateful moment where a massively successful, deeply overwhelmed, and slightly terrified Camila Cabello found herself completely, helplessly surrounded by this massive, intimidating, flawlessly dressed wall of flawlessly powerful Korean superstars closing in for the ultimate group photo, while she was undoubtedly relentlessly being violently assaulted by the heavy, aggressive, spicy, woody, and intensely musky luxury colognes radiating from the massive crowd of arrogant Western A-listers frantically running around the cramped venue. Suddenly, unexpectedly, and beautifully, she was hit completely blindside by the massive, disarming, intensely comforting, and aggressively sweet, fruity wave of Jungkook's signature aura as he stood comfortably right there in the mix. It must have genuinely felt exactly like being completely lost, freezing, exhausted, and terrified in a dark, intimidating, scary Hollywood forest, only to suddenly, miraculously stumble blindly into a brightly lit, overwhelmingly warm, beautifully fragrant, magical bakery absolutely overflowing with fresh fruit tarts, warm vanilla sugar, and the softest, most comforting, sugary delights imaginable. The sheer, terrifyingly brilliant psychological power of this incredibly sweet, unapologetically fruity scent is that it completely, effortlessly, and instantaneously bypasses every single one of your natural, evolutionary emotional defenses. It doesn't aggressively attack you or violently demand your submission like a heavy designer cologne, but rather it gently, disarmingly, and highly deceptively invites you directly into his intensely private, heavily guarded personal space, making you feel instantly, profoundly safe, incredibly warm, and completely helplessly disarmed before your logical brain has a single fraction of a second to realize how deeply and permanently you have just been seduced by the legendary Golden Maknae. It is this exact mind-numbing, fiercely addictive contrast between his terrifyingly masculine, heavily tattooed, fiercely powerful physical exterior and the incredibly soft, innocent, intensely sweet, mouth-wateringly fruity reality of his actual physical scent that creates a massive, inescapable black hole of pure, unadulterated charisma, aggressively pulling you in and refusing to
ever let you go, making it absolutely, undeniably, and scientifically clear why so many eagle-eyed, heavily invested fans passionately, fiercely, and confidently bet their very lives that it was precisely this massive, unexpected, sugary wave of Jungkook's aggressively comforting sweetness that instantly paralyzed Camila Cabello's nervous system, completely frying her brain, forcefully stealing her breath, and leaving her completely helplessly frozen in her tracks, completely unable to move or form a single coherent thought as she posed for that legendary history-making photograph. And there you have it, the absolute, definitive, intensely debated, and deeply analyzed top-to-bottom breakdown of the ultimate BTS backstage scent mystery that violently shook the entire Western music industry and completely shattered the global internet, flawlessly proving that while visual perfection, expensive designer outfits, and massive global chart records can certainly demand immediate attention, it is the invisible, deeply intimate, highly psychological, and fiercely personal power of fragrance that truly, permanently captures the trembling human heart. So now it is entirely up to you, the fiercely dedicated, heavily invested viewers, to violently smash that comment section and aggressively let us know exactly which member's intoxicating, mind-altering signature scent would personally leave you completely paralyzed, fiercely breathless, and absolutely unable to move. And don't you dare forget to aggressively hit that subscribe button, violently smash that notification bell, and stick around as we continue to relentlessly dive even deeper into the most insane, deeply guarded, and heavily requested backstage mysteries of the K-pop universe, catching you in the very next thrilling episode.